So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I think we'll starting right away. Thanks first of all, of course, for joining our training on the Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowships for this year. We've been doing this kind of trainings every year, but and we've posted the recordings of the past trainings. You can find them on our YouTube channel and on our website of Lux Innovation, the innovation agency of Luxembourg. But of course, every year there's a bit, some minor changes and some new additions, and maybe we want to develop our training also a bit along these lines. So regarding any questions that you might have during the training, don't hesitate to either send an email to msca@luxinnovation.lu or just use the chat. In principle, you shouldn't be able to turn on your microphone or your camera. We disabled that just that we don't have any involuntary interference. And with that, we can start right off. So a few house rules. Yes, you will receive the slides afterwards. You will receive the recording afterwards. We'll use the email addresses that you registered for this training. And you will receive an email once these things are done. That can take a couple of days. And if you don't receive anything in, like, let's say, a week's time, don't hesitate to reach out by email and get in contact. I mentioned the questions, so that should be fine. We try to answer your questions during the webinar. We'll see how long it will take. Sometimes it's a bit faster, sometimes it's a bit slower. We'll see. So I'm not quite sure if we'll get to the questions because it's a very long training, as you realize. Sorry for that, but as we said, it will be recorded, so you can go back to it afterwards, and we highly encourage you to do so, because we all know, the human attention span is what it is. So we drift off, and then it can be important to go back to the different sections as you will be writing your proposals or as certain questions come up. Please note that any kind of personal support that we offer, personal, phone calls, email exchanges, which is generally preferred. We only do this for participants that are doing their projects here in Luxembourg. So if you're in Luxembourg but doing your project abroad, or if you're doing your project abroad, that you have to contact your local NCPs, your local national contact points. So what are the aims of this training? So it's obvious we want to give you a basic information about the Marie Curie, Marie Sklodowska-Curie Actions postdoctoral fellowships. They used to be called individual fellowships. It's a postdoctoral fellowship program. A few ideas about the eligibility, the rules. Then we have two main target audiences. So one is obviously the applicants, the postdocs. That's most of you. And we want to, for some of you, it will be the first major international competitive grant that you will apply for. So we want to give you, an overview on the grant writing procedure, but we don't deal about the science part. I mean, that's where you come in and your supervisor. So we deal with the proposal structure, the clarity, and several elements that are not directly linked to the scientific objectives, which we cannot judge for all the thematics. Sorry. So the second audience is the hosts and the supervisors, so the organizations that are hosting you and their support teams, but also the direct supervisors, the people that you will be interacting with quite regularly, especially during the proposal writing phase. So don't get me wrong, it's still most of the work and the writing is still usually up to the applicants to do, but you need some information from your supervisors, and so we want to give them the training that they need. How do we help generally as NCPs? I have another slide on this later, but just to give you a quick overview, we offer this support to hosts and applicants based in Luxembourg, public, private. It doesn't matter what kind of organization the project is based in, but if you're going abroad, please contact your NCPs locally. We can send you the links where you can find them if you don't know how to do it. Our support in general is dealing with all kinds of questions that come up during the writing and the submission phase, and even once the project starts, hopefully. As I said, it's ideally we deal with these questions per email because we all have busy schedules, so we can just answer it as soon as possible. Then we do, and that's, I think, a major contribution is the proposal reviewing checks, which can be several stages depending on what you want, what you need, what you see as helpful. We don't have to be involved at all with the proposal. We don't have to check it before you submit it, but it's a service that we offer, and I'll go more into this later. And then, you know, once the project starts, there can be questions regarding the reporting, amendments, and so on. And this is something to worry on at a later stage, I would say. We don't really need to dive into that today. So again, the agenda is info about the fellowships, about the submission, about how the proposal will be judged and evaluated. And then the most part will be dealing with the grant writing and what we suggest should go into which parts of the proposal template. There's some bonus slides that I won't have the time to go into at the end of the presentation, but you will get them with the slides afterwards. There's part of it is the so-called green charter. This is a charter. It's not a mandatory document that your host or you need to sign. It's a document that you can mention, that you should read, that deals about, you know, that the objective of it is to make your project greener, in the sense, like, if you do lots of traveling, that you choose greener modes of transportation, for example, things like this. So that's a document you can mention in your proposal, but you don't need to sign it or something like that. There's the supervision guidelines. It's the same thing. Supervision guidelines, there's a part for the applicants, there's a part for the supervisors, obviously. And it's similar. If you make a reference or two in your proposal that you read this document and so on, I think that will come a long way. And then, sorry, what's new this year is we included a section on comments that proposals from Luxembourg received last year. And so that can help you just a bit better understand the mindset of the reviewers and what are the things that they're looking for. So it might apply to in your case, it might not apply. That depends on many things, but just to give you a bit of an idea, and we try to have positive and negative comments in that section. Sorry. Okay, so very first off, I know some of the hosts and potential supervisors are listening to this as well, and they might even have less time than all of the applicants have. And so I want to give a very brief overview of the main messages just for the hosts and the supervisors, so that you sort of, you know, have the main message right at the start, and I think that can be useful. So you as a host, so the host means the organization that is receiving or hosting the applicant, the postdoc in their organization. You take the lead for coordinating with your applicants. So you need to be the ones that decide how this is going to work out. Of course, it's a dialogue, so you have to sit down with your applicant or applicants and exchange what works best for you, what works best for them. But you are in principle leading this process. It's not us, it's not the applicants, it's usually this responsibility lies in you. And you can decide if you want to be very hands down or very hands on, that's really up to you. I suggest that you make it clear from the beginning what your expectations to the applicants are. If you want to be very narrow in your scope, if you want them to follow an exact lead or objective, or if you give them lots of freedom and so on. I think that will work better for both parties involved. But that also means that you should have your expectations set from the beginning. You're absolutely free to set internal deadlines to your applicants when you want to have which section to review or discuss or whatever. Obviously, again, in respect of your and their availabilities over summer. But that's possible. That's not something that we define. Make sure that you get that you know what is the administrative work that's expected from you as a host. It's not a lot, but you still need to prepare it, and it's very helpful if you do it early on, so you know what you have to do. Because every year again we see last-minute panics where you need to fill out certain details or something was unclear. So please check this beforehand. You need to register a PIC account. It's basically just a number that you get as an organization. Most of you will already have such a number if you ever participated in a Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe project, but it doesn't take a lot of time, but still you need to do it. Then there's an online part that's mostly up of the proposal that's mostly up to you to fill, or at least provide the information to the applicants and be available to them. And then some of you as hosts, so especially the non-private companies, will need to have a gender equity plan. So that's new in Horizon Europe. Last year under the Marie Curie, it wasn't required yet. So, but public research organizations, but also public organizations in general, they need to have this gender equity plan. And so we can provide you links how to do it. It's not terribly difficult, but it's something that needs to be done. Provide all the information early on. Who is the supervisor? What's a description of the company? How you will take care of integrating the applicant and so on. The training is very important. And then be responsive to your applicants, and that obviously works both ways. Every year we see applicants dropping out because maybe they found another opportunity or something like that. It happens, but the chances of this happening is reduced if you have a good relationship with your applicants. And then if anything is unclear, you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us, obviously. So some vocabulary first, and please excuse myself in advance. The European funding landscape is full of abbreviations and inside language and nomenclature, and it can be a bit confusing, and I'm sorry for that. Even myself, once you are in this program, you start using these terms, sometimes you don't notice it, that the general audience doesn't have a clue of what you're referring to. So I try to make this a bit clear at the beginning, and maybe there's things coming up later on. So don't hesitate to raise the issues in the chat or elsewhere. Academic sector, that's, well, it's obvious and also not. Obviously, a university is an academic sector, but for the Marie Curie public research organizations, they are also, or it can be even private, education establishments, research organizations in Luxembourg, notably the three LIs, the LIST, the LISER, and the LIH. They are counting towards the academic sector. Non-academic sector can be NGOs, for example, but it can be companies, obviously, in most cases. Then the beneficiary is the same in principle as the host. The beneficiary is the legal organization that's signing the contract with the European Commission. So that's company X or university A or whatever that is in charge of this. Associated partners, and that's a bit more tricky, and maybe we'll get into it in more details, or maybe it comes up during the proposal writing. In principle, the Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowships, they're mono-beneficiary, meaning you as a fellow go to one organization. Maybe you have exchanges with other organizations. Maybe you go somewhere for a secondment, and we'll get into what that is later. But in principle, these are not beneficiaries. These are associated partners. And usually you try to reduce them to a minimum. It's not mandatory to have associated partners, but in many cases it helps. For example, if you're a company, a small startup, let's say, and you don't obviously have a big training network and program like a university would have, it can make sense to involve a university and an academic partner, but it's not obligatory. So it depends. That's the short answer. So these are usually then associated partners. They participate in the action, but they don't sign it. They don't have a contract with the European Commission. They don't get direct funding from the European Commission. What are the countries that can participate? In principle, it's EU member states. It's countries that are associated to Horizon Europe. So these are countries that are not part of the EU, but that buy their way in, basically, to participate. And this is growing, this list, over time. For now, importantly, as opposed to previous years, UK and Switzerland are not associated to the program, and it doesn't look like the associations will happen any day soon, unfortunately. But there are other countries like Norway, Iceland, for example, that are associated to the program. And then every other country that's not associated is a so-called third country. Supervisor is the person that's mainly in charge that's mainly responsible for you during your fellowship at the host. So usually it's a senior person that has some research experience. In academia, obviously, this is easier because that will most likely be a professor who has a very good track record. In companies, it's a bit more tricky sometimes, but we'll get into that later. Below, you can find a list of all the countries that are associated or not to the European program, in case you need to know this. What are the main objectives of the program? So you might argue, well, it's for you personally, from your perspective, it might be just to get funding to do a nice project. But you need to look at it and on a bit broader scale, and it's important because you need to keep this in mind while building your argumentation. And you know, you probably are well aware of this. The Marie Curie programs are very competitive. It's not to be taken lightly. You need to invest a significant amount of time, but you need to make sure of what is expected from you, and what is the mindset of the average successful proposal as well. So, so major objectives of the program are to increase your employability and career perspectives within Europe, within academia, but also beyond academia. And so you need to build this into your proposal. It should be obviously an innovative and creative project for people holding a PhD. Well, we'll get into that in the eligibility criteria. There's a lot of focus now on international aspect. Obviously, mobility in Marie Curie is essential to the program. You move from another country to, let's say, Luxembourg and do your project here. But then you can also involve the organizations outside of Luxembourg and give an international perspective to the project. The project should be interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or whatever you call it. It's not only a buzzword, but you need to think about how you integrate different disciplines, what your project means to other disciplines that might be tangential to what you do, and so on, and how you describe this without, you know, obviously overstepping what seems logic and sensible. In the ideal case, there is an example of intersectoral mobility. What does that mean? That's if your main host, your beneficiary, is a private company, you could have a secondment, meaning sort of an internship as part of the fellowship to academia, or vice versa. Obviously, in some cases, this doesn't make any sense at all, so you shouldn't force it at all. But if it does make sense, it will increase the value if you can find a good secondment host, because they need to be on board of this and provide you some information. It can make a very strong proposal if it makes sense for your project. Of course, if you have, I don't know, 3-4 different secondments and you have to travel all the time during your project, it might be a bit disruptive. So please keep that in mind as well. Entrepreneurship, innovation, open science is all concepts that you should familiarize yourself a bit in case they make sense with regard to your project, and try to integrate it somehow. And then, yeah, the non-academic sector is important, and Of course, if your project will be based at a company, then you already don't have to worry about that so much. So there are two main flavors, let's say, of postdoctoral fellowships, and please keep that in mind, because when you click the Start Submission button on the official website of the call, because you need to click on that button to get the official template that you can edit, you need to select between European fellowships and global fellowships. 99% of you will probably select the European fellowships. It's the standard way of doing the projects, at least for Luxembourgish participants. It's up to 2-year project total duration in an EU member state or associated country, meaning the host should be based in a member state or associated country. The global fellowships are different. They can be up to 3 years. And they start with a so-called outgoing phase, where you go for 1 or 2 years in a non-European country, in a non-associated country. Very often it's the US or, I don't know, Japan, or countries like this. You spend this time in that lab, and then you come back to, let's say, Luxembourg for another additional year to sort of, share the knowledge that you acquired there with the local community. What are the changes this year? Or since 1 or 2 years, some of them. What's new is that you can have this so-called non-academic placements. What does that mean? It provides you an additional 6 months at the end of the 2 years, additional 6 months at a non-academic partner organization where you can pursue, valorize, exploit findings of your main project. And ideally translate these findings to something a bit more that can be more implemented, or that's closer to the market, that's closer to citizens, consumers, policymakers, you name it, industry. Importantly, this has to be a different organization than the one you've stayed in. Let's imagine you were based in a company, you have to go to a different company that's not linked to do this non-academic placement and get this additional 6 months. Again, as for secondments, it needs to make sense with regard to the project, obviously. Now there's secondments, so these, what I mentioned before, these sort of exchanges, collaborations where you go to a different place. They are now possible in third countries, again, whatever, Canada, China, you name it. But obviously it needs to make sense and it shouldn't be too disruptive. And as I mentioned before, the gender equity plans, they're mandatory now for hosts, for non-private hosts, basically. As a company, you can have it, obviously, but it's not mandatory. Sorry. So I go a bit into some important issues very early on, because these questions come up every now and then. The individual, you cannot be your own supervisor. That should be obvious, but it's not always. Your application needs to be complete. You need to fill out all the sections. Again, it should be obvious, but it isn't always. And sometimes people forget. I mean, the proposal is basically 3 parts. It's part A, which is online. Questionnaire, basically, it's part B1 and B2. Sometimes people forget part B2, and that's not good. You need commitment letters or support letters, whatever you call it. You only need if you do a non-academic placement. If you have sort of a secondment to another company, university, whatever, you don't need to include this letter. You shouldn't include this letter. You shouldn't include this letter of somebody saying that you're a great person and you do great work. This is not needed, this is not wanted, and there's no real place to upload these kind of support letters. So just that this is clear. Only 1 proposal per researcher, obviously. Let's imagine a researcher might be interested in 2 different positions. If they submit 2 proposals, only the last one that they submitted will be evaluated. But vice versa, a supervisor, an organization can obviously host more than 1 proposal. That's no issue. Eligibilities, very important, and please make sure that you understand these rules. They are not flexible, so make sure that you understand them. The most trivial but also important one is you need to have a doctoral degree and have it defended successfully at the deadline of the submission, which is September 14th this year. If it's 1 day later, if it's 1 hour later, then it's not eligible. So please make sure that this is the case. Nationalities can be any, that's great. The mobility clause, very important. You can, if we go from the premise that you're doing this project here in Luxembourg, you cannot have lived in Luxembourg or worked in Luxembourg for longer than a year in the 3 years preceding the immediate the deadline, September 14th this year. So let's imagine you came to Luxembourg September 15th in 2021, and you lived here or you worked here. It's fine. If you came here on September 13th, 2021, you're not eligible anymore. Then what's new since 2 or 2 years, 2 years, it's this maximum duration from your doctoral degree. So some people, they decide later in their career that they want to create such a fellowship or restart their career, whatever. So you need to be aware that you cannot have more than 8 years of, not more than 8 years can have passed since you obtained your first PhD degree or doctoral degree. There can be some extensions, they're listed here. We cannot for sure tell you if you're eligible or not, only the Commission can do so. But if you're in doubt, you can discuss it with us, and please read this. I think most of it is relatively clear. And on the side here, I put the link. That's the link for the guide for applicants for this year. Very, very important document. You need to read that very carefully. It's linked a couple of times in the presentation. Very important document. Here are some examples of this so-called mobility clause. Okay, so you move from another country to Luxembourg and you will do your project here in Luxembourg. That's okay. You move to Luxembourg, as I said before, after September 14th, and you do your project here this year. That's okay, or next year. Let's imagine you lived or you worked in Germany. I don't know, let's say in Bavaria, somewhere far away. For your project here in Luxembourg, you will move to close by border in Germany, Trier. It's not far. It's like, you know, a couple of kilometers to the border. It's cheaper than living here in Luxembourg, so some people do it. That's not okay, because you were living in Germany before, you will be living in Germany again. That's not possible, okay? If in the same scenario, you would move to a city in the French border with Luxembourg, in Metz, for example, that is possible because you moved from Germany to Metz, okay? So that is clear. If you, let's imagine you were based in, I don't know, let's say Germany, you move to Luxembourg, you do your project here in Luxembourg, but you will do an 8-month secondment, because you can do a secondment up to 8 months in Germany. That's okay, because it will be part of your project that will be based in Luxembourg. Now there are some more complicated cases, and we are learning here. It's new territory with this all virtual mobility and home office work. So we don't always have the questions ready for you, but we try to find them in case we don't. Let's imagine you have been working in Luxembourg, but remotely. You were actually living in Germany. Let's imagine Germany, okay. But you were working or studying, let's say, here in Luxembourg. So you had sort of a contract of sorts here in Luxembourg. But you were not physically here, you were only sort of virtually here. And this was before September 14th. So that will not be possible, okay? So if you had any sort of link, even if it was sort of virtual, you had some sort of contract with Luxembourg before, it's not possible. You're not eligible, okay? Okay. An important concept to understand, because it can be confusing, the secondments versus the placement. So you can have one placement, non-academic placement, it's called, and you can have secondments. The non-academic placement is at the end of the project, it's 6 months. It's in addition to your project. The secondments are part of your project. They can be up to 8 months or 1/3 of the total duration of your project, but since most people choose the 24 months as their project duration, it's usually 8 months. It can be one chunk of 8 months that you take anywhere in your project. It can be split up into several chunks. It can be several secondments, but as I said before, it should make sense. The host of the organizations of your secondments, they are not mentioned. If you fill out the online form, the part A of your proposal, there's a section of the participating organizations. You don't mention them there. It's only your host. But if you do a non-academic placement, you also need to mention them there. This led to some confusion last year, especially because this is new. It's probably not done in the best way possible, but it's the way it is. And I'm sure this question will come up again. So make sure that you understand this difference, and if necessary, go back to this document and look at it. Yeah, I mentioned this. Secondments are not mandatory, but there is a strong correlation of projects that are winning and projects that have a secondment that makes sense, that is at a good secondment place, and so on. So you need also good supervision at your secondment, and so on. This all needs to be clear and clarified in the proposal. But if these things are there, it makes your project more likely to be funded most of the time. Yeah. What else did I want to say? You need to describe the secondments in your main document in the part B1. That's the main part of your grant, your proposal. You need to mention it. You need to mention it throughout the document, wherever it makes sense. And obviously, it needs to be listed also in the part B2, which is more an administrative form, let's say. Then there's a third sort of thing that's not, it doesn't have an official status, but it's largely regrouped as short visits, and it shouldn't be confused with the secondments. Secondments and placements are not the same as a short visit. A short visit means you go to a conference, you go to a couple of days to some lab that you're collaborating with, and it's outside of the premise, the physical premise of your workplace. It can be international, it doesn't have to be international. Imagine you have to do field work or things like this. But the important element to distinguish is that the work that you do during a short visit is still supervised by your beneficiary here in Luxembourg. They are responsible, they are in charge. While if you go to a secondment place for a longer duration, you will have a supervisor, another supervisor there. Doesn't mean that your supervisor here in Luxembourg doesn't care about you anymore or cannot tell you things, but the person mainly in charge of you is there at the premises of this secondment, while for a short visit, it's still based here in Luxembourg. If you have questions about this, we can discuss it one-on-one. Home office, that's another element that's not 100% clear, even from the documentations like the Guide of Applicants. Like, as a general rule, virtual mobility, imagine you're based in, I don't know, China. You want to do your project here in Luxembourg, but you don't want to move to Luxembourg. You can do all your work remotely, 100% from China. That's not possible, okay? The project cannot be the virtual mobility cannot happen. You need to come here. However, like partial home office work might be possible under some circumstances. It depends on your host. It depends on some regulation. This is mostly important. Let's imagine the tax regulation is mostly important if you don't move to Luxembourg, but imagine you move to Germany. but you do most of your work here in Luxembourg, but then you want to have like 1 or 2 days per week of home office work, if it's in line with your supervisor and your host, then you need to be very careful because there are some regulations that are outside of our control and they keep evolving over time. So you need to be careful. If you're based here in Luxembourg, it's a bit more liberal in general. Part-time work is also possible, but it's not something you need to worry about now. Let's imagine for whatever reasons, it can be that you have a startup that you want to launch, or some other activities, you want to have another master's, whatever, something like that in parallel. It's possible. Let's imagine you do a 50% of your time only fellowship. So that would mean that your whole project duration will be multiplied by 2. If you want this. Obviously, if you want to have a 2-year project and you would do it at 50%, it would turn into a 4-year project. If you only have 2 years, obviously you would say you do a 1-year project. So the important thing is it's not encoded at the proposal stage when you submit. You don't mention it anywhere. And the reason for this is that they don't want reviewers to basically punish you or be biased against you if you say you do other activities besides the project. So this is clarified after you get the proposal, after it's funded. Then you can, obviously your host, your organization needs to be okay with this. And the project officer, so that's the person at the commission that's responsible, that's your contact person for your proposal, your project, needs to understand why you're doing it. So it needs to have a reason. But that's the way it happens. So nothing you have to worry about right now. Although, let's imagine you want to do maximum duration of 2 years, but you want to do it part-time, then you need to be, let's say 50%, you need to then only apply for a 1-year project because it would turn into a 2-year project at 50%. I think it's clear, I hope. The proposal submission. So there are let's say 3 parts. There's part A. It's mostly administrative information, but it also contains like the title, the abstract, the acronym, so very important elements. And the rest is mostly online things that you tick boxes, basically, that you need to tick, or some information, administrative information you need to provide. And then there's part B2. That's a document you fill out on your computer, and then you submit it as a PDF. You upload it as a PDF. And part B has 2 parts. Part B1, which is the project description. Part B2, that contains additional information. That contains your CV. It contains information about ethics of your project. It contains information like this. Okay. Part B1, important, very important. It's restricted to 10 pages. If you have more than 10 pages, it will be automatically cut and blanked and the information will be lost, okay? So don't do it. So don't include a cover page, don't include a table of contents, things like this. They will count towards your page limit, so don't do it, okay? Sorry. Yeah, then I mentioned this. The part B2 is it doesn't have an official page restriction. Of course, you should have something sensible. No reviewer wants to read your 50 pages of CV because you copy paste every single publication in full length. That's not the idea. It's suggested to be 5 pages. It's a bit flexible, but usually that's enough. Okay. Letters of commitment, as I said, only mandatory for if you do a global fellowship, but again, most of you won't be doing a global fellowship, or if you do a non-academic placement in addition to your project. So again, non-academic placement doesn't mean you do your project at a private company. It means you do an addition to your project another 6 months at the end of your project to a non-academic host, okay? And then participating organizations, you give a bit information about them. And as I said, support letters not needed, so don't worry about it. There are some formatting conditions. They are described in the texts that are here at the bottom in this document, so make sure to read them very carefully. respect the page sizes. There are templates. There are two templates. That's important. Okay, there's two versions of the template. There's the PDF version of the template. It's linked below, and there's the RTF version of the template, which you can edit. The PDF document you cannot edit. So the PDF document is annotated, gives you all this information, but you cannot edit it. If you use this RTF version, make sure that you respect all these margins, that you don't delete anything in the template, in this RTF document. Don't shorten the titles, don't change the titles. You can add more titles, and that's important, we'll get to that, but don't delete anything that's in there, okay? Use the fonts and the font sizes. Important element, because this question comes up every now and then, and it's something I often suggest for certain parts of the proposal to use tables, but don't overdo it. I mean, because the table fonts inside tables can be 8 points size, while the normal font can be minimum 11 point size. There were some very clever people in the past that just copy pasted their entire proposal into a table because they thought that they can use the 8 point size. Trust me, reviewers will certainly not appreciate this, so don't do it. But tables can be very useful to illustrate specific cases, and we'll get to that. There's another thing, and that's what document that we created internally. It's not an official document. It's not mandatory. We call it the extended template. What do we mean with that? It picks up the official titles that are mentioned of the different sections in the official template, obviously, but it adds more subsections. And why do we do this? So all these subsections, these are things that you might have written yourself anyways, but maybe you would have forgotten, or maybe you would have written it into the wrong place. And you have to imagine for the reviewers, it's very frustrating if they read the proposal and they cannot find the information that they're looking for in a specific place, but it's somewhere else. They will not find it, they will not look for it. So it helps you to respect the organization. It helps you make a clearer structure. It helps you better build your logical flow throughout the proposal. So we highly recommend that you use this extended template. There's a guideline in this document. If you haven't received it, contact us and we'll send it to you. But we highly recommend you take these subsections, you enter it into the official RTF template. You use as I said, the margins and the font sizes that were mentioned before, and then all should be well. It's really there to help you. And I will build a lot of the workshop today will be built around this document. Also, if you send your documents to us for reviewing and helping you, it also helps us to, find the information. So we really ask you to use this, especially if you want us to help you in reviewing your proposal. Yeah, if you haven't received the document, please contact us. How will your proposal be judged? So there are 3 sections, and there's 3 main sections of criteria. There's the excellence part, which counts for 50%. There's the impact part, which counts for 30%. And there's the implementation part that counts for 20%. So roughly speaking, because you have 10 pages, you can already kind of get the picture of how much space you need to dedicate to which section, more or less, okay? But very often we see people use 90% of the space for the excellence, because that's what they're used to, writing scientific text, writing reviews, writing long introductions with lots of references. This is not a review. It's not a manuscript. It's a grant. So you need to be very efficient and effective in your writing. You need to cut to the chase and not be repetitive and focus on the key points. And here are the key points. So if you respect all these key points, this criteria, so please, at whatever stage of your proposal, go back to this criteria and look at each of them and see if you, in your eyes, you're adhering to them as best as possible. What is the evaluation procedure? So if the project closes, the deadline, September 14th, there is sort of an eligibility criterion, eligibility check that's been done by the European Commission first. You know, if there's all the sections in there, if you fulfill the mobility clause, if there's ethics things, even though that will be brought up again later on. And what else? You know, the PhD degree and all of that. If that's okay, they will give the proposals to the respective chairs of the different thematic panels, and they will help select experts and reviewers that are really experts in their thematic. They can be based in Europe or outside, and that will be in charge of professionally evaluating your proposal. Then they submit their individual comments, and then there's sort of a consensus that's being written. Then there will be a full panel that will meet and discuss, have a consensus, and then there will be a ranking sort of your proposals. So all of this procedure takes a long time. It takes 5 months after the submission of your project. Imagine, I mean, every year there's around between 8,000 to 11,000 projects being submitted at the same time for the Marie Curies. If within your panel there's 2 projects with the same ranking, same score, sorry, then there's additional criterion that fall into place, and I think they're mentioned in the next slide. There's I link below, it's an old document, it's still online. It was a manual for evaluators for the previous work program, so Horizon 2020, sorry. But it's still very useful because it gives you a bit the idea of how they approach your proposal. If 2 proposals are ranked equally, then they will go through this algorithm of determining which one is ranked before the other one. And you can have a look yourself. Budget is something that luckily you don't have to worry about so much for the Marie Curie project. It's a lump sum based project, so meaning the project budget will be automatically calculated when you enter the duration of the project and where you do your project. So how does this work? You as an applicant, you will have a work contract with your host organization here in Luxembourg, usually up to 2 years. So it's a fixed duration. You don't have a direct contract with the commission. So it's the host, your organization that has the contract with the commission, that gets the money from the commission, and then they pay you in your work contract. How does this work from a host perspective? They get part of the entire budget. They get as a sort of a prepayment when the project starts, so that they sort of have some backup money. And then at the end of the project, you prepare sort of a report. It's a financial report and a scientific report, and then the remaining of the balance that's minus the prepayment will be reimbursed to the host. That's not something you as a fellow need to worry about. It's just that it's clear for the host how this works. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask us. There is, again, no need to provide any more funding to applicants from hosts, from Luxembourgish organizations, than what you receive from the commission. So what you receive from the commission, you subtract the employer's costs, the social charges, and all of that. You pay it to your applicants, and that's the minimum you need to pay them. You can pay more through different sources, whatever, but you're not obliged to do so. And that's of course very important to know for the researchers, but it's also important to note that you need to look at this very carefully. Of course, you want to know how much will I earn in my fellowship. It's a very valid question, and it's not a question I can fully answer today, and I explain you why. So let's look at the contribution, the budget that your host will receive for your salary. So there's two, maybe three parts of this. It's the living allowance, that's the base salary, let's say. There's the mobility allowance, that's just added to the living allowance. Don't need to worry about why this is called mobility allowance. It doesn't mean that if you travel in the course of your project, you need to pay this from your own pocket. No, it's really just a compensation because you are moving to another country. That's basically it. And then some people, they are applicable for a family allowance on top of that. That's also added to the salary. Here in Luxembourg, as far as I know, none of these three elements are taxed differently. So it's all just basically one salary that you get. And we can have a look at the family allowance, how this is calculated, and when you come, when this is applicable, but you can also look it up yourself in the documents. So this amount, this is not, importantly, this is not what you as a researcher will end up with every month in your account, okay? This is a gross amount. So you need to subtract the employer's costs, taxes, social contributions, and it's not, certainly not to us, always very clear how much this amounts to. There's a way to approximate it with a platform that's linked below. It's an official platform, and you roughly, if you don't have this family allowance, so you just take the living and the mobility allowance, you would end up with this salary here. But please don't take my word for this. This is not something I can guarantee. There might be things that I forget. I'm not a tax advisor. I'm not a lawyer. Maybe your host can advise you a bit on this, but that's just to give you a broad idea. And then there's two more items that are more important for your host, obviously, that are the research costs and the management costs. Research costs, they include everything, basically. They include when you travel. They include when you spend money on consumables. They include money you spend on buying a laptop for the action. They include money that you spend for training and so on. So that all falls into this, and it's 1,000 euros per month. So it doesn't mean that each month you have to spend 1,000 euros or else it's lost. It just means if you have a 24 months project, you will have these 24,000 euros available as a total budget. If you need to spend more, then it needs to be your host that needs to be okay with this. And then the management and indirect costs, this is paid through your host to the organization, and they can do with this money whatever they want. They can spend it on the research costs, they can pay their electricity bills with it, they can do what they want. This is not audited, okay? So just that this is clear. Here are a few more details, what falls into these various categories, the research, training, and so on. You can have a look at this, but it's not something we need to go into detail here. Submission procedure, very important, obviously. Who does what? Okay, so it's a bit flexible. So you have to discuss this with your host. Who does what? In principle, the host, they need to register for their PIC number if they don't have it already. And please do it in advance again. The applicants, they need to create an EU account. It can be done very quickly. If you go to the call website that's linked multiple times, you click on start registration, start submission, sorry. You click on it and they will ask you for your account if you don't have one already, and you can make it there. Who submits, who does the final submission? That can be you or your host. Okay, you just need to be coordinating it internally. How does it work? Again, go to the call website. Here's the link. I know it sounds scary, but click, you need to select here if it's the European or the Global Fellowship. Click on the Start Submission button. I know it sounds scary, but then you are being taken to the screen that you see on the lower right side that mentions Create Proposal. And there in the red square, you see Download the templates. So these are the editable templates that I mentioned before, okay? And then you need to enter very early on in the proposal creation the PIC, as I mentioned before. So maybe your organization already has a PIC, so then you can look for it or you can ask them and so on. And there's a tool to find it and so on. And then you fill out your documents. You can upload them there as a PDF, and you can And I highly recommend this, even though, again, it sounds very scary, but submit it as often as possible. So what do I mean with this? If you have some version and you are approaching the deadline, let's say 2 weeks in advance, 1 week in advance, upload a version of your PDF proposal and click submission. What happens then? Basically, what happens is, first of all, you understand the whole procedure, and you have a first online backup, basically, of your document, and you see how everything works. And imagine whatever the commission web servers, they crash at the call deadline, and you will not be able to upload for whatever reasons. Then you still have the version that you uploaded. Okay, so we recommend this very often. Submit every version towards the end. Every version that you make, where you make some changes, submit it and resubmit it and resubmit it. And only the last version that you submitted will be evaluated, okay? So this is the timeline. This is when the call started, and the deadline is, importantly, September 14th. Then around February next year, you will get the results. And then, if successful, there will be a grant negotiation, a grant agreement between the European Commission and your host. That will take some time. So usually the projects can start around April, March, maybe more likely April 2023. But for whatever reasons, you can also delay the start of the project. And the latest I think you can delay it is September 2024. Even though you are submitting now in September. Okay. What are the next steps? Okay. Obviously, you should have your host already fixed, and you should be starting discussions with them. Think about secondments. Think very importantly about your career development and your trainings. It's a very important element, and I'll get into much more details. But also start writing, because it takes more time than you think. It gives you more time to give to many people to review and give you comments. So please start as early as possible. And I mentioned it before, but what can you do to help yourself, basically? Read the applicant's guide, check the proposal template. There's also the NCP handbook. That's an old document, refers to the previous program, but I linked it here because I think it's extremely useful. Many of the things I mentioned in this extended template are based on this document. Very useful to understand the logic behind certain things. There's also a self-evaluation document. You can help you judge your own proposal, or maybe other people. What you need from your host, you need this administrative information. You need to pick, as I said before, you need to know if your host has a gender equity plan, or if they need one or don't need one. You need some information about your supervisor, okay, their personal background, their experience in supervising, and so on. And this section needs to be developed because it's an element for if you're going to a famous, well-known professor at a university. This is something you need to worry less about. But if you're going to a small startup, it's something that can be a weak point, your supervisor there. So you need to address it, and you need to develop it well. It's not an issue if you develop it well, but you need to think about it. It doesn't just happen by itself. Yeah, be concrete. Think about your trainings and think about how you complement your host. That's a very important element, how they give you new information, networks, knowledge, experience, skills, but also the other way around, how you bring these things to your host. How do we help? We offer support for Luxembourg-based projects, Luxembourg-based projects. We can help you with your questions on all these issues. We help you with reviewing the proposals as much as we can. You know, it's holiday season. There's certainly parts where I will not be available over the summer. But please check in and send us your versions early on, because if you send us your basically almost finished version 2 days before the deadline, and we give you tons of comments, you have no way of being able to integrate them. So make it as often as is possible and makes sense. In the past, the proposals that we reviewed had a much higher success rate. It's not always so dramatic as in 2019, but often that you see quite a good effect, which we hope is due to our support services, at least partially. So keep that in mind. What are other external ways of supporting you? So some people, they use professional Marie Curie specialized consulting companies. Obviously, these are paid services, and maybe your host will cover them. It's something you can discuss, or they can discuss with you if they see the need for that. It's an investment. It might increase your chances. It's certainly not mandatory. So most of the proposals I've seen from Luxembourg in the past years that were successful didn't have any sort of consultants involved, but it can still make a difference. So if you have questions towards this, don't hesitate to get back. Okay, so now we move to the more substantial part of the webinar, but also what will be most important, I believe, for you. So first of all, let's start with some basics, some general guidelines. So for 95% of you where I will receive proposals review, I will refer at one point or another to the clarity of the project. So make sure that your ideas, your objectives, your context, your background, your methodology is clear. And I know there's no universal definition of what is clear and what isn't, but don't make it more complicated as it is. Try to have a logical flow. I know how it works for proposal writing. You start writing all over the place and then you move around sections afterwards, and in your mind they're still somehow linked and you don't even see it. But when I see documents like this, and when reviewers see documents like this, it will be a break in their reading flow. It will be, even if it's only subconsciously, it will be sort of an alert system goes off, and they don't appreciate it. So try to be clear and get to the point. Don't use this, especially often non-native English speakers are doing this mistake. I'm doing this mistake myself for sure, is that we try to use very fancy language, complicated words, and please don't do it. Please make it as easy as read as possible. Don't repeat yourself. Don't use all these small phrases that extend the length of your proposal, but don't add any information. Like, I don't know, it is often said that, things like this. They don't add any information, so try to just cut it. Yeah. Okay, let's start with the abstract. Very often the abstract will not be the first part that you write, but maybe even the last part, and that's fair enough. But it needs to be very well thought out, and it cannot just be a copy paste from your introduction or something like that. The abstract has a very specific purpose. It's really to guide the panel chairs to select the experts for this. So you need to be clear about it. You need to know what is the problem that you're addressing. Why are you doing this project? Why do we care about this project? Do other people care about this as well? Is it like a EU priority in some regard? And that might be something you're totally not familiar with. So just Google it, Google whatever you're working on and add, I don't know, European Commission or something like that, and you will certainly find some discussion, some white paper, some policy document, and you can refer to it, because you can just say, yes, I'm doing something that Europe cares about. Okay. Then why now? Why you? And why with this host? Very briefly again, I mean, an abstract is super short, but all these elements need to be reflected somehow. And don't for sure don't speak about a lengthy background and references and things like this. So, and distill the entire project, ideally. So that doesn't only mean the science, it means also the training, your career development, outreach that you do, and dissemination that you do. These are all very important elements that I will certainly mention at some point in our proposal review to you, because it's things that you usually don't see as a main priority, and I do get why you don't see it as such, but it is, from the European perspective, it is. Here are some links for past projects that are somehow public, so you can have a look. It's not much, but maybe it helps. So sorry, that the link here I provide here is not entire project, it's the public abstracts of past projects. So basically every project, every Marie Curie project there is, so it is quite exhaustive. So you just enter your keywords and you can see the abstracts of other successful proposals like this. Okay. So let's start off with the main sections of the part B1. So that's 1.1. It's you can see the lengthy title here. So I try to highlight some important elements. I will not read out this out loud. It's in on the slide. It's in your document. It's in the template. But just I'm trying to highlight some of the important things. Basically, you know, what the message you want to pass here is, why is your project original and innovative? And now here I go into a bit more length, is what you can see the difference. Here in the official template, you only see the point 1.1. It's this title. But here we provide additional subsections, so 1.1.1, 1.1.2, 1.1.3, and so on. And we recommend that you adopt this because it helps you think about all the things, and it helps you put the right things in the right place, because it's not always clear what should go where. Sometimes it's a bit similar, but there's a twist to it. So hopefully this helps you. The intro, first thing, should be short and simple. The first sentence, ideally, we recommend is describing your whole action, because it means that immediately the reviewer and we understand what you're trying to achieve and why. You know, say I or researcher X, Y, Z will do this and that when the host X, Y, Z. It allows you to jump immediately into what you're trying to achieve. Very often I have proposals, I read basically one full page, and I still don't know what they are doing in the project, and it shouldn't be. It should be right away, straight to the point. And then you go into a bit more background and context. You give context. You give context of why this is a big question that you're addressing, why it's a big challenge, how it affects all of us somehow. Even if it's very abstract, you sort of need to show why it's not only your host that cares about this. It's a global or European issue. And you should also at this point give some context. So very often policy context. So have other governments, either here in Luxembourg or in Europe, the European Commission, do they care about this issue? Have they investigated this issue? Are there other existing projects on this issue? So please check this. And then refer to them. You don't have to go into length, but just show that you're aware that this exists and that your project doesn't stand on its own feet, but it exists in an ecosystem and in a context. Then state of the art, keep it short. This is not a review where you have pages and pages of giving references. Keep it as short as possible. Say what has been done by you and by others on the issues that you will discuss. You don't have to say everything that's somehow linked, but stay on the topics that you will address. Because if you address a certain issue and you say this hasn't been done very properly in the past, but then you don't address it in your proposal, you raise false expectations, and that can be dangerous. So only state things that are important here with regard to your project. And I often recommend even structuring this very clearly and saying, like, this is knowledge gap number 1. You know, you describe an issue that hasn't been dealt with properly in the literature so far. You describe why it's an issue, and you say, this is KG1, knowledge gap number 1. You can call it whatever you want. It's just a suggestion. But it allows you later on to go back to this KG1 and say, I address KG1 in my objectives 1 and 2, and objectives 1 and 2, they are part of work package 3 and 4, and so on. So it might not sound like it makes a lot of sense, but it will add immensely to the structure and the clarity and the organization of your implementation part of the project. So the project management of your project, that is something that you might not be used to so much, but it is something that can kill your project if it's not done properly. Then next step, objectives. So very often people have one overarching goal, overarching objective, and then several, let's say, sub-objectives, okay? So I recommend, again, using a bullet point list here. Don't spend too much time, don't spend too much text. Say objective 1 is blah, blah, blah. And then say they will be addressed in work package, so and so. Don't have too many. And try to understand what is an objective, because if you're not used to thinking about project management, very often the mistake that people do is they think, oh, my objective 1 is experiment 1, objective 2 is experiment 2, objective 3 is experiment 3. It shouldn't be an action that you do that's an objective. One of your actions should address the objective, but it's not the same thing. An objective is, why are you doing this action? Why are you investigating? Why are you doing this experiment? To reach a certain new level of understanding, something like that. So try to think about it a bit more than just giving it a brief thought. And try for your objectives to think about, how is anybody going to judge whether you've been able to reach your objective or not? But that comes down to more measuring and measurability metrics. You don't need to provide a very clear number or target here, but you need to think about other people and how they see your objectives. If you state something very broadly, very diffuse, that's not tangible, sorry, how will anybody be able to say whether you achieved your goal or not? So try to think about that. That's important, and it's a point that we see sometimes raised by reviewers. Part B, 1.2, that's basically the methodology. Okay, so again, moving a bit more into, I skipped these. You can have a look more carefully. These are like one-to-one taken from the annotated template, so no need to raise it. Moving to the extended template structure. So that we suggest splitting up the methodology into these parts, and the later parts, the 1.2.2, 1.2.3, and so on, they are very important, so don't forget them. Last year, again, we said the same thing. People didn't mention it properly. They get criticized by the reviewers, okay? So the methodology part itself, it's pretty self-explanatory, but think about it from the perspective of concepts and assumptions that you need to take of why you're approaching the project, why you're using this technology, this approach, this methodology, and not something else. Don't try to make a big block of boring text that nobody will read. So try to structure it a bit more user-friendly. Show that these methodologies is really fitting your objectives and helping you address your objectives. You can mention challenges here. There's an additional risk section that's later on, but you can already mention challenges of your methodologies here and discuss it a bit. Why are you using this methodology and not another one? You can, if you're doing a secondment, mention it, because usually you do a secondment because you can do or use or learn a new method at this secondment place. So mention it here. It's important in the context. Mention the work packages that these methodologies will fall to. but don't go into all details. Don't explain every single experiment that you do. Don't explain every single task that you do. That's more suitable to a different section. That's section 3.1. Still, even there, you shouldn't describe every single small step that you do, but it's for some things it's more appropriate. Interdisciplinarity, you need to explain why your methodology is interdisciplinary, why you're using different approaches from different disciplines. Sometimes it's easier than other times, I fully agree. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, but then you need to argue why it doesn't make sense. You cannot just leave it away because you think it doesn't apply to me. That will be criticized, okay? So you need to think about this, and you know, try to look at it. Don't overstretch it. Obviously, don't say, well, you know, all these very unrelated fields contribute to this methodology if it's not the case. But also try to think a bit outside the box and don't only say like, oh, okay, use this very limited methodology because it's linked from this 2-3 disciplines that all basically the same thing. So that's not really interdisciplinary. Gender dimension, next point, very important again to mention, but please try to understand what this refers to. Gender or diversity dimension of the proposal of the project means if the science you're doing, the research you're doing has any gender diversity dimension, meaning, I don't know, imagine you develop an application that will be more likely used by, let's say, males versus females, okay? So did you think about this? Did you keep this in mind, or vice versa? It doesn't, and I stress this again, it doesn't reflect the gender balance inside the project, your supervisor, yourself, your team colleagues, your organization. That's not part of it, okay? It's really just, imagine you're doing I don't know, a more medical research, and whatever disease you're studying is more prevalent in one population versus another. You know, you should mention that and think about it, keep it into account, and you know, that if you don't have any dimension at all, just mention it. Say, there's nothing that we foresee, but if something comes up, we'll take it into consideration. I think that's perfectly valid. Open science and open science practices, please familiarize yourself. We could have a whole separate webinar on that thematic, but I think there's plenty of good information out there. So if you're not familiar, please have a look. Sometimes people regroup it with data management because it's a bit, there are obviously links between the two, but try to understand what it means and try to understand that that it's important and that you need to dedicate some space to it. Okay. Then 1.3 is an extremely important section. It's about the supervision and the training. Again, this is the official text, and then I will go into the structure that we suggest in the extended template. Usually you have one supervisor, or at least one main supervisor. If you have secondments, you have for each secondment another supervisor. Sometimes people refer to co-supervisors, that's okay, but don't stretch it too far, don't have a whole, you know, range of supervisors and so on. Focus on the first point on their qualifications, meaning what are their skills, what is their background, what are the qualities, what is their experience in supervising people, very important. Also here you can refer to the guide for supervision, obviously. Refer for their role in the PCDP. What does that mean? That's the personal career development plan. That's a document that you need to develop as a part of your project. So it doesn't have to be included in the proposal, but think about it very carefully already now, because it's extremely important. So the main point here of this section is why is this the best person supervision for this project? Obviously, in many cases, this is easier than in others. If you go again to a very well-established professor, everybody knows, it's easier to argue about this. They will have a ready-made section. You can just copy paste it. They will put it into all of their research grants. And so it's easy. If you go to a startup, it's more difficult. And you need to think about it carefully, and they need to think about it carefully. So please make sure that you and they take their time to develop this. It's not an impossible task, but you need to, I mean, for sure, they will have very important things to learn, to teach you about entrepreneurship and all these things. But you need to make it clear what their role is, how they will help you, and if they are the right person to help you. Then 1.3.2 and 1.3.3, to me, these are, besides obviously the science, these are the most important sections of the proposal. So it refers to transfer of knowledge. And so one part is transfer of knowledge to you from your host. And one is the transfer of knowledge from you to the host. Okay, don't mix them up, obviously. And please, please, please just dedicate a lot of thinking and a lot of space to it. And use your space wisely. You know, again, this is a very good example where a table can provide much better information than a full page of text. It's much easier to understand, much more visual, but be very, very precise and concrete. Often people in the first iteration of their project, they will write something like, I will receive training in this and I will receive training in that, and that's it. That's great, but that nobody will care about it. Everybody can write a generic text that's non-commitmental, that doesn't have any details, so nobody believes you. So you need to be more precise. You need to state how this knowledge will be transferred to you in this section, or vice versa. In which form, when, how often, how long, by whom, what's the objective, what's the methodology used. Don't stress it too much, but try to provide the crucial information and make it as precise as possible. And if you're at a company or a startup that doesn't have many internal training programs, you need to think about external trainings and mention them, because they are extremely important for your career development. Okay, so mention also the secondments here. Mention the different types of trainings. There's a nice section on this in this NCP handbook that I mentioned before. You can read it, it's very helpful. Certainly mention the career development plan here, which is a mandatory deliverable, meaning a document that needs to be submitted during your project to the commission. And then vice versa, the section 1.3.3 is the transfer from you to the host. That's equally important. You might have lots of skills and knowledge that your host doesn't have, but if you don't explain it well enough how you will transfer your knowledge to the host, it's lost. You will receive a bad score in this section. So think about how you will transfer your knowledge to them. Again, how, when, who's the target audience, what do you believe will be the effect for the host? And so you see, you need a little bit of information from your host there. And so you need to discuss this and take your time. Again, secondments. And then there's an additional section on non-academic placement, obviously only if that is the case for you. So moving on, section 1.4 is more about your skills and the career you had so far and the skills you accumulated so far. So here the main goal is to explain in the section 1.4, why are you the best person for this project, Why do you have the skills that you need at the start of the project show that you have these skills that you need. Doesn't mean the skills that you want to have during the project or at the end of the project, but the ones you need from the start. So show that you have the right background and mindset. Okay, so now we're moving to section 2. So section 2 is the impact. Usually this is where it starts to be a bit more difficult for scientists, at least, to think about it, because we are more used to think about the science of the project and the methodology and so on. But the impact here is extremely important. So section 2.1 is the impact on your career of this project. So again, we recommend that you subdivide this further. And you have the first section that's your expected skill development. So try to distinguish this a bit from previous sections or later sections. Use a bullet point list and just explain how your skills will develop, improve over the course of the project. Again, be concise and don't spend too much time. So don't mix it up with the other sections. So section 1.3.2 is the trainings that you receive, which will allow you to increase your skills and so on. Section 1.4 is the skills, I just mentioned it before, is the skills you already bring. Section 2.1.2, you see how this is confusing, is the impact that these skills that you will acquire will have on your career. So it's the next section. I would recommend splitting this. So in section 2.1.2, you explain what your ambitions are, and if you have multiple options, that's fine. You can mention it. Doesn't have to be academic. Try to make it somehow, in the range of possible scenarios. Of course, in the past we've seen people that write that they want to have an immediate professor position afterwards, and maybe that's true in some cases, but maybe it's not. So try to think about this and be realistic, and demonstrate how this all comes together to help you reach your goals. Okay. Section 2.2, and that's, besides the science and the training part, another extremely important section, and very often misunderstood. So I stress this. Please think about it very carefully. There are three parts, at least three parts to this. It's dissemination, exploitation, and communication. And every time, all of the time, people mix these up. So please take your time and try to understand the difference. There's documents from the Commission and other documents I link below that will help you with this and understanding it better. I try to discuss it a little bit here, but it goes a bit beyond the concept of this this webinar. But very important to distinguish. So first of all, they're not the same. Dissemination, exploitation, communication. And very often people especially dissemination and communication, they don't understand well. Dissemination is about sharing your results, your findings, your outcomes in a professional setting to help you reach the goals, the big overarching goals or whatever of your project. So what's important here is the professional setting. So professional setting depends for each project, obviously. The main way of dissemination is usually the scientific community. So meaning publications and books and chapters and conferences where you present your work. But it can go beyond, depending on the aims of your project. So it can have, professional settings can also mean policymakers, politicians. It can mean NGOs or industry. So it depends. So make sure, again, I'm going back to this measurability, and very often people refer to this so-called SMART criteria. So if you are not familiar with this, look it up. It should be somehow measurable if you're trying to reach people. If you write a publication, it's pretty measurable. You can see how many people cite it, if it's a high impact factor, journal, and so on. But for other things, it can be a bit more tricky, but at least try to show that you think about this. Exploitation, this is basically about what happens to your results sort of after the project is finished to reach additional goals that go beyond the immediate scope of your project. So it can be data that you generated that other people can pick up and do additional projects on it. It can be collaborations, product development, spin-offs, and so on. I linked lots of guidelines there. Communication, as opposed to dissemination, is about non-professional audience. The first thing that comes to mind is the citizens, the general public, but there's many others as well. And depending on the settings, it can be policymakers, if they haven't been included in the previous one, or industry, for example. Depends a bit on where your project is mainly focusing on. So please have a look at what's available in your host, at what's available nationally. You might not be familiar with this. I provide here the link from the FNR, that's the National Science Foundation for Public Research. They have quite a bit of activities that you can simply participate and volunteer in the course of your project. There's the Researchers at School program, where you go to schools and explain to the pupils there what you're doing, why it's important, why it's interesting, why science is amazing, and so on. There's the science festival that they organize researcher days, and so on. So these are a few ideas, and obviously you can go beyond. You can include social media. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, everybody was doing, social media accounts for their project. I cannot judge if that makes sense or not. If it makes sense, by all means do it. People do sometimes project websites that can be interesting. Depends again. And then there's an additional point, that's IP management, that might be applicable to you or not. But again, a huge topic that's basically needing a whole different workshop. Then 2.3, that's more about the actual impact outside of your personal career. And so that's taken together with the previous section. The previous section is basically what do you do to reach these impacts, these outside impacts. And here it is about what are the actual impacts. And they are threefold. And so we recommend splitting them into 3 parts: scientific, economic, technological, and societal. I agree, for some of your projects, one or two might be more relevant than others. So think about that. Don't overstretch it. Don't say your whatever solution will change the world if it won't. Or it's always great to be ambitious, but don't overstretch it. Be realistic. But you need, again, this is a very tricky section, even for us, because for us it's very often difficult to judge. So maybe your supervisor can help you with this, or other colleagues. But it's something you need to really spend some time on, because it's easy to say, oh, my project doesn't have any sort of economic impact, and then you will have some of the reviewers that says, hey, that actually does have an economic impact and it's not mentioned, so I give it a very low score. So that's a danger. So try to keep that in mind. Okay, so we are done with parts 1 and 2. So we are moving to parts 3. Parts 3 is the implementation part. So that's basically about project management. And even though we all believe we are great project managers, it's not always the case, unfortunately. And so you need to prove somehow that you will be able to manage this project, and that you have everything well structured and everything in place to support you in managing this project. So we recommend starting off with work package tables. So why tables? It's again, it helps you give some structure. It helps you not forget anything. So I gave an example taken here. Obviously, you don't need to copy paste it, but it sort of has all the important elements. So try to think about that. You shouldn't have too many work packages, obviously. If you're totally unfamiliar with the work package concept, and you might be, that's fine. But please read about project management to understand the basics. Again, it goes beyond the scope of this webinar to explain everything in detail, and other people can do it much better than I can. There are good books about it. There are webinars, both free and paid, and free documents. So try to have a look. We recommend not to have too many work packages, usually around 6 or so. Not too many scientific ones. So certainly not, experiment 1 is work package 1, experiment 2 is work package 2. No, the work package concept is more about how do you organize your work that it makes sense in a practical term, not necessarily because you're using the same technology or same methodology, but simply because that's the most practical way to structure your work. And it might not be, a work package might run over the entire length, and it might have breaks in between or activities higher and lower throughout the course. That might be fine. But think about it as a chunk, a way to split down your work. Don't forget to mention, to give a work package title that's short and easily understandable. Like, I don't know. It depends on your project, obviously, but something that's very precise, that because the reviewer, they don't care if you're speaking about work package 1 or work package 20, they care about what does this work package do. Don't forget to mention the tasks, break down the tasks. Don't forget to mention the deliverables and the milestones. Again, concepts that you need to understand. Appropriateness of tasks. That's again a very difficult section. There's no clear guidelines, guidance to how you best do it. Every reviewer sort of has their favorite way. Keep it short because you don't have much space left at this time of the project proposal. But basically try to quickly explain why in this work package you're using your resources, and resources are time and financial resources, in the most effective way possible. So yeah. Then have a Gantt chart. If you don't know what a Gantt chart is, this is an example of a Gantt chart. There's probably better ones, and there's certainly worse ones. A Gantt chart shouldn't be too huge, but it should be, because it will count towards your page size, but it should give you a good overview of what you're doing, and when you're doing it, and when is your deliverable, and when is your milestone, and when is your secondment, and so on. So have a look at some examples that you can find online. Another very important, even though I say this basically to every section, but this is also very important, is the risk assessment. Again, very clear point for making a table here or bullet point list, and say what things can happen to delay or hinder the progress of your deliverables or milestones. And it can be, very often it can be scientific risks, right? Something doesn't work, some methodology doesn't work, some machine doesn't come in time, or whatever. So try to think about it this way, give a bit of context of if it's likely or unlikely in your eyes, and try to be realistic, because reviewers, they understand if you're trying to fool them. So try to think about these things. Don't try to hide it. This is really the opportunity to highlight the weaknesses that you have, but at the same time give you an opportunity to say why it's actually not a weakness. Okay, so that you can use that as strength, and don't think about impossible things to happen that could happen. Yes, you know, a global pandemic has significantly increased in likelihood. Maybe 5 years ago, if somebody would have written that might be a major risk to their project, I might have shrugged it off, as would have had many other people. Nowadays, we think about this differently, obviously. But sometimes you see things that are just so far-fetched or unrealistic that it's more humorous than really helpful in the proposal. This is the last part, so that's the quality of the hosting. I would love to say you don't need to include this because you don't have any place left by now, but it's not the case. You need to have it. It's different from section 1.3.1. This is really about, which is more about the supervision and the supervisor. Here, this is more about the surrounding, the infrastructure, the services in place, basically just showing this is a good place to do your work. Okay, there's the right equipment, there's the right people, there's good opportunities to network, there's people helping you if you need them. You can mention the charter and code. If you don't know what it is, look it up, and please check if your host has endorsed it or not. So it can be a slight plus, or if it's trying to do so. Mention any relevant recruitment policies or work-life balance. I think that's something that's significantly risen in visibility in many workplaces nowadays. So try to highlight it. You know, you can make a short reference to the Green Charter here if it's irrelevant. Yeah. Don't provide too many details. There's some information. There's a similar section in Part B2. That's table 2.2. So we haven't gotten to Part B2 yet, but it's not exactly the same thing. So don't just copy paste it. That's certainly not the idea. Then mention how you will be integrated in the team and the institution. I think that's, again, a good opportunity. You don't need a lot of place for that, but mention like social activities and just show that your host is doing an effort of that you're not just, you know, cannon fodder and you're not just a cheap workforce that they get paid from the commission, but that they actually care about you and that they care about integrating you. And so that you also show this, okay? And then we recommend mentioning just very briefly some support services that might exist, like bigger organizations obviously have EU offices. This is not always the case, but most of you will have an HR department, and then you can highlight a bit how they will be able to help you. And then if you have associated partners for secondments, you can have a specific point about their arrangements there, but you can also just mention it elsewhere. Okay, so we've gotten through two parts B1. So congratulations, you made it this far. It's not over yet. Huh? You need part B2. The first part here is the CV. So I recommend sticking, not overstretching it. Give people a good and fast impression of your career achievements or personal achievements or a mix thereof. People are moving more and more into narrative CVs. If you don't know what that is, I put a link there. Even here in Luxembourg, we are doing the FNR is doing a big effort on pushing this issue. The idea behind it is that you should focus less, your achievements should be evaluated less on metrics like citations and so on, and age indexes and so on, and more on actual achievements and contributions that are more reflective of your circumstances. This all sounds good in theory, on paper. Nobody can tell you what the reviewers will think when they see the documents. So I recommend doing a bit of a mix, having maybe a short paragraph, personal introduction of your CV, describing yourself in a few words, something like that. and then have also the more classical format. General recommendations. Whenever you make any sort of claim, please justify it. It's again about this clarity, but also about being concrete and tangible. If you make claims, try to at least have the possibility to back them up. Some of these keywords are very important to think about or mention, so don't hesitate to let this flow into multiple places in your proposal. And keep in mind relevant EU documents, white papers, strategies, and so on. Usually they're easier to find than you might think of. You just probably never had the need to look for them. But think about this. Then yes, be nice to the evaluators. And the biggest favor you can do them is making a neat, clean, clear proposal that's easy to read from beginning to the end. Here are some online proposals. Maybe some of them are not online anymore by this time. I haven't checked them. Most of them might be older, but it can be interesting to just check out if you have no idea what a proposal might look like. Maybe it helps you, maybe it doesn't. Maybe you think your panel, your thematic is very different than others. That might be true. But if it's needed, it's here. Again, here are some useful links. Some of these links I provided already before, but here they are just again as a reminder. And that's already it for the most part. So let me first thank you now. Don't hang up yet. If you have questions, ideally you contact us through email. Either use my personal email, charles.betts@luxinnovation.lu, or use our MSCA@luxinnovation.lu email address. It works just better than if you call me, because we all have lots of meetings, and an email I can answer in the meantime. But if you disrupt the meeting with a phone call, that's not ideal. But of course, if you feel the need for a personal exchange, you can always feel free to request that, and then we can try to arrange it. Since we have a few minutes, we can go briefly through the bonus slides, just that you know what they are, but I won't go into the details. This is what I mentioned before. These are reviewers' comments, which you will also get at the end of your revision process. And they're split between good and bad, and they're split between excellence part, the impact part, and the implementation part. So have a look at them yourself. Usually, I have to say, when I read the proposals and the comments, I tend to agree with many of the comments that are being made, even though you might feel differently. Obviously, it's more a personal, criticisms that you feel personally attacked, and it's sometimes difficult to take a step back. But that's something we can discuss. So there's good comments and bad comments. Here's some slides on the guidelines of supervision. And as I said, I don't go into detail. And there's some slides about the Green Charter, which I will also not go into detail. So just that you know they are there, and the reason why I didn't explain it in much detail is you can just read it, and if you have questions about it, don't hesitate to ask us. Okay, so I'm stopping my presentation, and I'm switching over to have a look at the chats. So let me see if I can answer any of them already here on the fly. And if not, then I might be able to get back to you by email, or some of you might be might be interested in having a personal meeting. So there's a question about a hospital. of course, hospitals are more than welcome for applying for research proposals in the Marie Curie. In Luxembourg, unfortunately, here it's our hospitals are not so present yet in European research programs. It's coming luckily more and more. I'm saying this because I'm also responsible not only for the Marie Curie part as a national contact point, but also for the health-related calls. So there are specific research calls on the health thematics. And I'm happy to see that more and more hospitals also in Luxembourg are more interested in this. That's great. And we're happy to support you, but this is just as applicable to be it an NGO, a company, a research institute, a patient's organization, a city, an administration from a ministry. All of these are perfectly fine as a host organization. Recommendations on handling the time between the defense and potential acceptance of the application. There's no application. There's no recommendation. You can have two perspectives. Obviously, you have the applicant perspective and you have the host perspective. From the applicant's perspective, so first of all, there's no obligation whatsoever. Some organizations stay hire on a temporary basis applicants to cover the meantime, and then take the risk of either getting the funding or not, and or drop the contract then or not. That's one way to do it. It's certainly not possible in every case. There's not much that you can do in this time. There's ideally you would already prepare some background work, but most of the time it just means waiting until you get an answer. And I know it feels extremely long, but there's not much that you can do or influence it in any way. Figures, it's a good question. Generally, I like figures in proposal if they're not overdone. Don't think about a figure as a scientific figure that you have in a publication. Think of it more like a graphical abstract that more and more journals now have. A way to explain something in a very visual, pleasing way. But think about it, your figures should be something that you can read from like far away and understand the meaning and the aim of whatever you want to explain with the figure, without having to go very close and reading fine print text and lots of data points and things like this. That is usually of no use. People sometimes bring the argument, yeah, okay, but what about previous preliminary findings? Okay, first of all, it's not mandatory. If you have some, it can be interesting, but don't go into detail because you don't have the space to do it. You can mention it, you can, and then people either believe you or they don't. But don't go into lengths. I've seen in the past people spending one page with figures of current preliminary findings, and that's certainly not in the scope of a project. So figures can be good if they help you explain something better than with a block of text. So the worst thing you can do is lots of blocks, big paragraphs of text, because I can tell you from reading and reviewing lots of proposals, there's nothing worse than reading these kinds of proposals, but only use them if they help in the understanding. And it's also something that I will comment on if you provide them, so we'll try to help. Next question. No, if you spend time in Luxembourg as a PhD student or whatever else other function you had in Luxembourg, you cannot do for Marie Curie fellowship. You cannot do it in Luxembourg. You can, you could do the global fellowship. So you could do the version where you spend 2 years outside of Luxembourg and then come back for an additional year in Luxembourg, shows to share the knowledge that you got outside. But for the normal fellowships, that's not possible, unfortunately. The law requires you to be hired with a permanent contract. Yeah, I understand the issue, but it's issues like this are just not foreseen with this mobility clause, and it's not flexible, so it's not something that can be changed. But if you want to discuss it one-on-one, I'm happy to do so. Yeah, we shared training material, no problem. Somebody wants to do a research and RTO and then do a secondment at university, no problem at all. It's very common. Ideally, you would have, in this case, 2 secondments, one at a university where you provide maybe more the academic and training part, and one at a industry partner, but maybe that doesn't make sense, maybe it's not possible, and so on. But what you propose is perfectly fine. Okay, if your host is a company, is it possible to do the extra 6 months in the same company? No, it's not. It has to be a different company, and it's also not possible to have a company that's linked. Let's imagine an international company that has companies all over the world. You can not say, okay, I changed companies, but you're actually doing the same company in a different country. That wouldn't count towards it. So it would not be possible. Does the publication record of the applicant determine the success? It contributes, okay? I'm not going to lie about it. I can give you the official version of the commission, and that is they want the proposals to be evaluated in a forward-looking way, meaning judging more the potential of the applicant than the actual past achievements, because your past achievements, they're very much a function of the opportunities that you received. If you had the chance of, I don't know, staying in a very famous lab in a very big university that has lots of funding, you will have a different publication record, I can guarantee it, than if you spend in more time in a university where this is not the case. And it tells us nothing about your quality and your potential. So that's the theory. The reality is still reviewers very often like to rely on some, well, first of all, their gut feeling and their personal opinions, but also on some kind of metrics. And here, of course, if you have a better publication record, it will help. If you're not, it doesn't mean you have no chance, but it might be something that you need to address in the proposal in one way or another. You might have to explain why this is the case. You might have to set yourself an aim to achieve more in the course of the project. And so I wouldn't say you have no chance, but obviously the better your publication record is, the better it is. What's the percentage of application success that for proposals that have gone through Lux Innovation? So I don't have a global figure. I only have numbers for the past 4 years. And so remember, before there was the 2 years ago, there was still the Horizon Europe funding framework program, so it was a bit different than it is now. For the last year, oh well, let's put it this way. Every year I have data on proposals that have received received comments from us, proposal checks from us, have had on average a higher score than the ones that don't. Now, the degree by which the difference is changes year to year, and it's sometimes out of our control. You have to imagine sometimes we receive proposals that are of very, very low quality, and the applicants, they don't have any ambition to increase the quality because for various reasons. And we have nothing to change that. We will just label this proposal as we gave them some support, and so maybe they didn't take up that support. So that's unfortunate, but it happens. So that counts, of course, to our statistics. But in general, people that have gone through our support have higher scores. It's usually not fantastic. I'm not lying. The scores are not 50%. The scores are in the last 2 years a range of between 15% up to 20% for proposals that went through Lux Innovation. 2019 was exceptional. There we really had, I think, a case. We had a statistics of 40% success rates for proposals that went through Lux Innovation, but I think that was more an outlier. Of course, you can argue, well, proposals that are interested in getting support are usually by applicants that are interested in doing the best they can. So already they are more motivated. So inherently, these are better proposals than people that are not informed or that only realize that we exist like 2 days before the submission. So maybe it's a bit a biased statistic, but I try to avoid statistics in general. Very often people also ask me, oh, what are the success rates in Luxembourg versus the success rates in that country or that country? Honestly, it doesn't really make a lot of sense because there are many factors coming into this, and you can pass whatever message you like without having a real beneficial added value of just mentioning the statistics. Okay, as an applicant from Germany at a host in Luxembourg, can I get support from Lux Innovation? Absolutely. So we support anybody that's coming to Luxembourg and that's doing a research proposal at a Luxembourg-based organization. But if you are Luxembourgish or you were based in Luxembourg and you go to Germany for your Marie Curie, we are not the organization to help you. It's the German NCPs. You can still try and contact me, and I might still be able to help you with a small question if I have the time, but it's not our mission. It's not our job. Okay. And there's you can, if you look for, you can search, if you try to find the other NCPs, how to contact them, you can just Google NCPs Horizon Europe, and you will find a website where you can say, I look for NCPs for Marie Curie program in country, whatever, Germany, and then they will give you the contact details. I cannot guarantee that they have the same services than we have here in Luxembourg. Every country is organizing this a bit differently. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. Okay, let's wait a few more seconds if there's additional questions from you. If not, again, you know that this question, the presentation will be put online. The slides will be sent to the email addresses that you registered, and if you don't receive them in 1 or 2 weeks, send us an email and we'll send them to you. Good luck. If you want to schedule more individual sessions, don't hesitate to reach out. If you have specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Take your time. It's really now the time to start writing. It might seem still far away and you might be busy with other things, but trust me, the earlier you start, the better it will be, because everybody at some point will run into time issues, and it's not obvious, and it will be very tricky in the end once you approach the deadline to squeeze everything in the 10-page limit. But it's the reality, and I hope, even if for some of you this will not be successful in the end, I hope that the process will be very enriching, and I can almost guarantee for most people that I've spoken to that underwent the length of and looked at and took it seriously and did an effort, that they got something out of the writing process, even if they didn't get a grant. I cannot guarantee it, unfortunately, but I hope it's the case for you. So I wish you all the best. Thank you again for attending and listening for this very long session, especially the people that stayed somewhat alert and didn't read too much of their emails in parallel. Thanks again, and see you soon, hear from you soon. So, and best of luck. Thank you.